India's problematic, entirely centralized digital identity system?
So you're not wrong. This one is definitely close to my heart. And not just because my aunt was on it, one of my favorite people, but also because I think there's so much mythology around Aadhaar, and it's not really understood outside of India very well. And I think there's a lot of hype when it rolled out about what an amazing system it was. And as we learned in the episode, there are a lot of challenges with that system. Certainly it remains and stands one of the most the biggest experiments that are ongoing in terms of digital identity in the entire world, but it's not without its challenges.
One of the things I was so struck by is your aunt comes at this problem from a very different position than, say, the typical sort of cypherpunk crypto take on privacy and freedom, right? She's really not even in any way steeped in any of that thinking or knowledge. She's just all about the human rights, the rights of people. Yep. And so it was really striking to me, one particular moment, and it'd be interesting if viewers haven't heard this episode to hear that moment when the penny dropped and went, oh my God, she's just nailed something. Where I think I'd always looked at the digital identity problem and said, you know what? Yes, I get it. There's this real problem of privacy. How are we going to deal with this? And yet we have an equally big problem of people who do not have their access to this apparently very important requirement that our society needs to have some form of identity, right?
Yep.
And that, I laid it out to her and said, what would, refugees are going to need something when they cross a border. And her answer was something to the effect of well, we should just not have wars, right? And which sounds really idealistic, but it actually is the heart of the issue. Because if you are going to empower people and give them rights, then maybe we wouldn't have wars, right? This is what are our priorities kind of point toward all. That in some respects is also where a lot of cypherpunk, crypto people come from as well, is just fix all this kind of individual rights issues, property rights, everything else, and then everything else will flow from that. I don't know that I have entirely that sort of utopian view, because I know that there is just real problems that are just, whether we like it or not, a legacy of the nation state structure that we live in. However, it's so refreshing to just sort of bring that to the fore and just say, no, this isn't just something that you just see as a trade-off against some other goal. You prioritize it. It really is fundamentally important. And it got me also thinking about, conversations we've had about surveillance capitalism, this idea of how we are all kind of losing our own free will in many respects by having our data not only controlled by these centralized platforms, but actually turned against us in this manipulative manner, that this is actually a challenge to the very idea of human freedom and our own individuality. So, really, really big, weighty ideas here.
Yeah, well, and I think as we move more and more into what we've talked about, this sort of mediated reality where our online identity, our digital identity, and I don't mean literally our credentialing. I mean the person that we are demonstrating ourselves to be in an online context, in the metaverse or in a game or in a whatever it is, and the person we are kind of outside of that context, that becomes more and more blurred as we see an expansion into Web3, the metaverse, other kinds of things. It's just so important to kind of question the premises of things. And there is an argument to be made, there's the standard incrementalist versus revolutionary, kind of tension that often exists in any sort of innovation. But it's important, I think, for us to go back to the very premises and what are our assumption spaces. And so I always feel like, it's kind of like The Economist, right? The assume the hammer, kind of approach. But yeah, assume the nation state. Well, maybe we need to kind of recast that. And maybe we have to be building systems for such a time when that may be less of a critical kind of identity, national identity might be less important if climate change really does come in and force us all, to reside in close proximity in a lot less landmass. There may be the time when that doesn't matter. And so what are we building these systems in anticipation of? And are we cementing, I think really importantly, are we cementing any systems that currently exist? Because if we do that, it shouldn't be accidental, it should be deliberate. And it may be, Michael, I'm with you, right? It may be that in some cases that is the way to go, or there's strong arguments to be made that is something that we should do, but it certainly merits discussion and debate, which we had on this episode.
Yeah, and thank you for bringing your Chiti. That's how I pronounce it, right?
Chiti, yeah.
Chiti onto the show to do it. And I must say, I became a bit of a fanboy of hers, but would be remiss to not also point out that Marta was, as always, tremendously articulate and fantastic. So everybody, like, have a listen. I hope you enjoy it.
Today is a very special episode for me because we're focusing on both a topic and a country that are very close to my heart. Now, I know it's out of fashion at the moment in crypto circles to talk much about blockchain, but I still have an outsized interest in the technology that underlies the applications we talk about a lot on this show. Perhaps that's because I came to the technology through a Web3 lens, after reaching out to some friends for ideas about how to decentralize the storage of a data lake of the social enterprise where I was working. Of course, at the time, I didn't use the term decentralized, and I didn't even know what I was looking for. But when a friend idly mentioned I look into blockchain, it didn't take me long to realize that this new technology held tremendous potential, and not just in financial services. I should note that, as is true for many of us who've thrown ourselves into the crypto ecosystem, my fascination with the concepts and principles that underlie decentralization, things like agency, empowerment, and equity, goes way back before my introduction to blockchain, way back for the Satoshi white paper, all the way back to when I was a kid. I'm what's often called a dual culture kid, meaning that I spent a whole bunch of my childhood in various parts of two countries. In my case, the US, where I was born, and India, where I spent a lot of my early childhood and school holidays with relatives from both sides of my family. As a result, Indian culture is in many ways as much a part of my mental model as American culture is. When I was a deeply impressionable tween, I wound up meeting one of my mom's many cousins for the first time. Usha Ramanathan, or Usha Chiti as I call her, is a lawyer by training, which not coincidentally is a big part of the reason that I went to law school. She's also a famous, though she'll object to that adjective, human rights activist who has worked her entire career to make sure that the rights of historically excluded persons are respected. Starting in 2009, she tirelessly challenged the controversial Aadhaar digital identity program in India, objecting to both its privacy and its security risks. And she was such a strong and effective advocate that Access Now gave her one of their Human Rights Hero Awards in 2018. You can imagine the impression that meeting this woman had on this idealistic young kid. And you can probably imagine what a kick it is for me to be able to host her on the pod today. But let me start by providing a very brief background on Aadhaar for those who aren't familiar. Aadhaar is the world's largest biometric ID system. An Aadhaar number is a 12-digit unique identity number issued by the Unique Identification Authority of India, the UIDAI, to all Indian residents based on their biometric and demographic data. Aadhaar data is collected by the UIDAI, which was set up by the government of India in January 2009 and further cemented under provisions of the Aadhaar Act in July 2016. Aadhaar is pretty much the opposite of a decentralized system. And in fact, the honeypot of data it presented got the government into hot water on more than one occasion. In addition, obtaining an Aadhaar number required an individual to divulge highly personal information, and as everyday tasks like grocery shopping or getting petrol or life milestones like getting married or applying to university began to require the having of an Aadhaar number, many citizens became increasingly uncomfortable. We'll get deeper into the various controversies shortly. Also, while we won't necessarily go deep into the legacy of colonialism in India the way we have on some of our other episodes, I'll note that August 15th marked the 75th anniversary of Indian independence, and the shadow cast by the preceding 200 years of oppression is a long one. In addition to my aunt, I'm absolutely thrilled to have on today's show my extraordinary friend and Web3 denizen, Marta Belcher. She's a pioneer in the area of blockchain and crypto law, who serves as general counsel of Protocol Labs, chair of the Filecoin Foundation, and special counsel to EFF, the Electronic Frontier Foundation. A few weeks ago, she testified in front of the Senate Committee on Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs about cryptocurrency. Before we bring our distinguished guests, let's welcome my co-host, Michael Casey. Hey, Michael.
Hey, Sheila. How's it going?
Yeah, it's going. I think, as usual, we could do a huge recap of the news of the week in the crypto ecosystem and everything that's been going on since our last recording.
Yeah, well, two historical events. It seems like we had the 50th anniversary of the end of the Bretton Woods system.
Yep.
Part one earlier this weekend, and yeah, the Indian 75th anniversary of Indian independence. And so it does feel like we're in the midst of a lot of historic moments. We've got the September 11th, 20th anniversary coming up at a rather, ignominious moment, of course, in Afghanistan. So yeah, it's sort of the echoes of history and past mistakes sort of swirling around us at the moment. I was just thinking, listening to your monologue there, and I was thinking about okay, can we look at some of these initiatives that happen and recognize, at least start with the acknowledgement that they probably begin with good intent, right? I mean, and I'm actually thinking of a parallel here between Aadhaar and Apple's latest controversy. I'm sure Marta's going to have something to say about that, with regards to trying to, stop child sex trafficking and abuse of children via iPhones. It's reasonable to understand that these initiatives are done in good faith, right? Because but just hear me out.
Yeah, I'll bear with you. I'll let you finish.
Hear me out for a second. Certainly in the case of India, I mean, the lack of an identity, the idea that digital identity could be the solution for the unbanked, for all the excluded of the world who do not have access to anything because they don't have a way to prove their creditworthiness or anything else, it has a romantic appeal to it, right? And so therefore, okay, let's go in and build something big and traumatic. And, the Indian government, being what it is, wants to do it all from the top. But the lack of appreciation for the multiple problems that you then create by creating these centralized honeypots, and the sort of sheer danger. I mean, in some respects, it's the lack of appreciation, and it is a little odd that Apple would not be aware of this, of course, but that network of information, that sort of like insidious amount of control that comes from all the data that is captured in these sophisticated algorithms and everything else, not recognizing that means, it seems to me, that these problems just emerge out of ignorance in many respects. But there may, of course, be a more sinister story behind it, and I'm really looking forward to hearing your Aunt Usha tell us a little bit about what the history of that is.
Yeah, well, I think these are always values-based approaches, right? And it depends on kind of what you value and what you're positing as oppositional to that value system. So a lot of things are rolled out in the name of ease of use or convenience or efficiency, and that is certainly a value. And one could argue that, from a certain lens, that can be productive and helpful. I think some of the technological rollouts are often in the name of efficiency, ease of use, and convenience. And I think that at this point in time, we ought to be very cautious if that's the kind of prime directive for any kind of initiative, right? Because we've definitely seen the major dark side of a lot of kind of initiatives that began in that way. I could go on about, the road to hell, et cetera, with good intentions. But I do think anytime you're dealing with biometric information, the standard of care is just elevated to a degree.
It needs to be a lot higher. You want friction, you want delays. You do not want efficiency when you're talking about biometric information.
That's exactly right. And so I'm sure we'll go into at some point during this conversation, issues around the use of data, humanitarian data within refugee camps or times of crisis. There's a really great body of work led by all kinds of people around the world, including my aunt, but also Nat Raymond, the HHI out of Harvard, just a whole bunch of examination of like, why do we suspend rights in the context of crisis and call that okay? Why is that okay? Like, if anything, shouldn't we be more protective of rights in that particular context, or have a kind of mode of engagement that ensures that we're not trampling all over people's privacy and security, right? Because we're trying to get them understandably very important resources like water or food or medical aid or whatever it is. No one's contesting the necessity of those in times of crisis. Thinking about Haiti is a very current example. Nevertheless, if anything, I think our level of care needs to be such that we are providing the highest standard we possibly can.
Absolutely.
But certainly more qualified guests than me to speak to these topics. So maybe we'll turn first to Usha, to you. And maybe just a little history about Aadhaar. I think there's some stuff that made it through out of the Indian press into the kind of world press. At this point, I think people just take it for granted that Aadhaar's always been around. And some of the sort of controversy isn't necessarily as talked about today as it was even a few years ago. So maybe you can walk us through how this all started, how you got involved with this, what the things that really sparked your concerns were, and we'll kind of go from there.
We have different points from where we start understanding this issue. The first thing is that you have your 9/11 moment. In terms of these kinds of technologies, our moment really was what we call the Kargil War in 1999. It became a time when we saw an enemy at the border and needed to identify, and the state felt that it needed to identify people within the border so that you can make a distinction between friend and foe. And that was like a benign beginning. It quickly changed from 1999 to 2003. It shifted from one border to the other. The Kargil problem was with Pakistan. But by 2003, when they were changing the Citizenship Act to say that we needed a national register of citizens, and everyone needs to get onto this, we had already shifted to Bangladesh and illegal migration. So it's a hodgepodge of ideas. But the one that that industry picked up, and that's what ultimately prevailed, is the one which said that there is a lot of, it's the time in the early 2000s, we had a lot of problem with our service delivery of food especially. And there were a lot of activists working on this, trying to change the system so that what was to be sent to the poor would actually reach the poor. Technology stepped in, the technology company stepped in and said, all right, we'll give you an answer to this. Now, the problem with this, one major problem with this, is that technology companies don't know the poor. They've never dealt with them. It's not their business. And they are as far away from the poor as anybody can be, because they are, I don't even have to explain this. So they don't know what the lives of the poor are, but they were looking at producing technologies and the uses of technology, which would control the lives of the poor in the name of providing identity to people. See, the way they identified the problem was to say that the poor are not able to get welfare. They're not able to reach their entitlements because they don't have an ID that they can show to the state. This was actually not, it was proved to be completely wrong and misplaced by the time the project was a little way through. So if you look at, we have 1.3 billion people, now we have more. At that time, we had almost 1.3 billion people. And they found at the beginning, when half the population had been covered, that less than 1% of the people did not have an ID which they could use. So why were you producing this project? Because you didn't, you were just looking for a justification for the project, not identifying a need. Second thing is that they were offering it as a solution. Now, you can never offer a solution without knowing what the problem is. That's one thing. But we've also shifted from there over the years, where first it's offered as a solution, then as a service. Then they say that this is just creating infrastructure. Then it becomes platformization. And it keeps changing and moving further and further away from people. So in the beginning, when they started, those working in the right to food, right to work, people working on right to housing, now these were the people who were saying this is not a good project for the poor. And the reason is this. First, everybody knows, and everybody knew then, that the digital divide is huge. People will lose control over their own lives if you have to hand it over to technology. The second thing is, when they started the project, they had no clue whether biometrics can or will work. In fact, they knew that they did not know. So it's not just that they did not know, they knew they did not know. And you had the mission director of the project even say in an interview as late as 2011, over a year after they had started collecting all this biometric data, that, well, we might be able to get everyone onto the database by, getting the demographic information and various kinds of biometrics, but they may not, especially migrant workers may not be able, laborers, manual workers, and we have a large number of them. They may not be able to use the biometric to identify themselves because their fingerprints will be frayed. You can't ask migrant workers to preserve their fingerprints, right? And then, of course, they found that, older people, it doesn't work. Children, it doesn't work. You have to keep going back and updating. And over the years, we've seen that the reliance is, when they began in 2010, one of the slogans of this project, which was, put out by Mr. Nilekani, who was heading the project, was that roti, kapda or makan is now passe, which is to say food, clothing and shelter is now passe. What you need now is a bank account, a mobile phone and an Aadhaar, all three being numbers. So they were working at reducing people to numbers because the three ideas which have been dominating this project are unique. And for a long time, we thought uniqueness came from biometrics. In the beginning, and then we realized, no, it's about being able to uniquely identify every person by their number. And then that It will be ubiquitous. So it has to be in every database. It has to get on everywhere. And then it will be universal. So everybody must have it. This was the object of the project. And now we find, now most recently we had an issue with this because the system hasn't been created so that the poor can use it and can have services delivered to them. So recently, one of our academic activists, Jean Drez, had written a piece with his colleague where he said that this one of those who's entitled to social security pension, who's entitled to state support for food. Now she was finding that she was not able to get onto the systems because while in the beginning they said that this will help you reach your entitlement, very quickly this idea of inclusion became a point of exclusion. To say that if you don't have this number, if you're not able to link it with whatever system we are asking you to link it with, if you can't identify yourself through this number at the point that you come for delivery, then you will stay excluded. So they came and said, listen, she has lost that card on which she had it. She doesn't have a number and there is no way of retrieving. And the person who had been mission director then and who's head of our, the health ID system that they are trying to put in place, which is just an extension of the UID, he turns around and says, we told you right, we knew all along that this would not work. That's why we told you that the number in full should have been on every system. Then she could have just gone and got the number from anywhere. So it is a project that was made for the techies. It was made so that they could displace Silicon Valley. Like they used to say, Silicon Valley caters to 1 billion of the world population. We will cater to the other 6 billion. That was the ambition. So, if people, which is why when they started, when young people started dying, old people started dying because they were not able to link their UID number, that's the other number, to their food database. And therefore, they couldn't access food. They were too poor to be able to do anything about it. It's not even like they hadn't enrolled. The second stage of linking, they were not able to do. And when they said that they died, in an interview with one of our senior journalists, Veer Sanghvi, Mr. Nilekani said, well, on the whole, he pointedly asked the question 3 times. 11-year-old dies because the system doesn't let her reach her food. Doesn't it bother you? I mean, is it okay? And he ends up with the answer that on the whole, I would say it's okay. That's the project.
So, Usha, I mean, the thing that seems disturbing about this an extra thing disturbing beyond the picture you paint of, in contrast to the well-intended concept that I raised at the beginning, that there really was something far more sinister behind it. In addition to that is the idea of how do you actually get out of this? Is there anything that activists like you and anybody who is pushing against the Aadhaar system that you have in mind to unwind? It feels like one of those horrible, Byzantine things that just takes over our lives and becomes extremely difficult to break down, a kind of a Leviathan. What is the answer? How do you undo what was done?
Okay, the first thing is I really wouldn't use the word sinister, because sinister has, it's like it's being done by forces that we don't understand. These forces we understand. There's nothing sinister about them. They are just, overly ambitious and avaricious. And the tragedy is that we see a complete lack of compassion. That to me doesn't mean, sinister actually excuses them too easily. And I don't think I want to give them that escape. Okay.
I wasn't speaking harshly enough then. Okay, I'm fine.
No, yeah, you were kind of.
I was being nice with the word sinister. Okay, good.
Yeah, you should understand. In India, mysticism is quite normal. Okay. So sinister would work, but lack of compassion wouldn't. So okay. But on what does one do about this? Actually, from the beginning, we've been saying that this could be either a project that is technologically good, but a bad idea, a really bad idea. Or it is technologically bad and a really bad idea. As it works out, it's technologically bad and a really bad idea. So if you look at the biometric database, you look at the demographic database, actually you can't look at it. That's the point. It has never been audited. It has excluded people. It has said that when you go in for enrollment, it will say you're already on the system, whereas you're not on the system. There is no feedback loop. There is nothing. So it's basically about amassing people onto that website, onto their database. And it works through the system where the state says that, and the current dispensation does believe that. It believes that they've inverted the relationship between state and people. So it's not the people who own the state owns the people. So you've got to obey. And if you don't manage to obey, then obviously you can't be part of that, part of there is no entitlement. So for what we've been saying for the longest time, and it's very interesting, we have in this COVID time, they've created this CoWIN app. So everybody has to register onto that app to get vaccinated. So you can't get yourself vaccinated without being on that app. And that's, ever since the UID came in, Aadhaar came in, every system that is set in place is by a small set of people. They are the group who have created what is called India Stack. And that whole imagination is only about creating databases upon databases upon databases upon databases. And in this COVID app, when people had to register, they needed anyway for, vaccination was as important then as, tracking people. So they said, okay, if you don't do it with an Aadhaar, do it with whatever government given ID that you have. That same head of the Universal Health ID, he had to admit that not even 14% of the people who registered onto the CoWIN app registered with the UID. They all use some other ID. So I actually think that we've reached that point where either people are not able to use this number and nobody knows it. I mean, no one's really bothering to find out what is happening with it. Or people are choosing not to use it because they don't see it as the kind of ID that gives them what they want. It's become something that you do when you are coerced to put a number in. Otherwise, you don't use it. So people are withdrawing from it in various ways. And it's not being recognized because the moment you recognize it, you'll have to actually audit not just the system itself, but the use of the system, usefulness of the system. So in our work, we very often say that we don't set a target and feel we failed if we have not achieved that target. For instance, the best thing would have been to dismantle this whole system. It's dismantling itself. You know how in one of the documents that Mr. Nilekani was chair of that report, they call this in the UIDAI, they call it the self-cleaning system, which means, he says, garbage in, garbage out. And when you're looking at all these revenue systems where you're going to introduce the databasing model again, and where you're going to privatize the database, they say, we all know that it will be garbage in, garbage out. So we have created in the UIDAI a self-cleaning system, which doesn't mean that the system will clean itself. It means you yourself have to go and clean it up or you can't use it. So people who can't clean it up drop off. We call it civil death. And that's the kind of thing that happens. So there are various ways in which systems destroy themselves from within.
Yeah,
it's just that we know that you can hollow out and still pretend to exist. And we see quite a bit of that happening. The danger is that they've got this number embedded in so many places that they can use it in various ways to generate, to pretend that that's accurate data and to build up on it. Artificial intelligence is going to be more artificial than intelligence. That's what I expect.
Yeah, this idea of almost like in this species or the populations getting to this broken point. There's a biological element to this that I find quite interesting, that eventually it just becomes unsustainable and dies. And we have to invent some other way. I think that's the only way I imagine that goes, but it's fascinating to think this through. Yeah,
I think they would be looking to morph it rather than let it die. And we are watching that.
Evolution. There's a couple of things I just want to reach out and flag from what you've said, Chipti, which one is, this story of the older individual who didn't have the access to the fingerprint or to the card, and so wasn't able to get groceries, which is, I mean, that at scale, and these are very real stories. And I know that there was a whole team collecting these stories from different parts of the country and all of that at one point in time. These are very real stories, right? And so there's often criticism, I think, of decentralized systems of saying, well, no one's in charge. Who do you go to get access to the system or whatever? But here, I think you're seeing an example of where at scale, there was nobody to go to get access to the system. It didn't function. And there was a centralized authority, if you want to call it that, in place, right? There was, in theory, at least some kind of process or whatever that I'm sure involves standing in line for 4 days and, whatever, paying some, whatever it was. Didn't work, right? So it's an interesting kind of parallel, because that again is a criticism of decentralized systems in which the rest of us are kind of really spending a lot of our time and focus. The other thing I think is that I think of this as such an important object lesson. So just in terms of, if you don't focus on what is the problem, who is the community that you're trying to support, and you don't embed that point of view and start with that predicate, you're going to fail. I mean, you just are kind of inevitably going to fail. Maybe not right away. Maybe there'll be some limited modicum of success, but ultimately you can't succeed if you don't locate and centralize, as it were, the community that you're really trying to support, right? And so here, debatable whether that was the cover for the activity or actual the intention. I mean, you are more well embedded in what was real there, what was not. But we can certainly say that there was no inclusion of these communities, of impoverished communities, or otherwise historically excluded is the phrase I prefer, historically excluded people from these systems in the build, the design, any of the considerations. Therefore, it's impossible to expect that would actually work. So one thing I do want to talk about, though, is in some of these systems, there's also a lot of concern about surveillance. Is that something that's come up in UID and other in general? Was that a concern at the beginning? Privacy is one thing, but the idea that the government is tracking you in kind of a very active way, this Orwellian kind of way. Can you comment on that and its relevance in this ecosystem?
We actually call it, when we have our fun discussions, if I may, on this, we think of it as when Bentham meets Kafka. God. It's that kind of a scenario. So, see, it's true that industry wanted this, or, business interests wanted this. But you have to sell it to a government, because remember that in this project, the state was a very important component, because they had to coerce people. They had to use their power of coercion to force people to get onto this database. People were not running to get onto this database. So you had to make them, and they wanted it all within a short time. So the one major thing that was used was state coercion. Now, how are you going to sell it to the state by saying, I will collect data and I will do whatever? So tracking people was the sales pitch. So with the Manmohan Singh government, which came before, which is like much more, tuned into capitalism, where they had a problem, it was slightly different in the sense they had a problem with, like the World Bank has. World Bank keeps saying that, you've got to streamline your welfare system, social delivery systems. But actually what everybody knows that what it ends up doing is squeezing people out of it. So basically the whole conversation on that goes in a way where it says that there is leakage, people need to be tracked to see that no wrong person is collecting this. So you put a huge onus on the poor to come and identify themselves every time and to say, I am a legitimate claimant to this entitlement. And that's been the kind of game that we saw in the liberalization era, where they said everything has to go to the market. State should be pulling out of everything, including welfare. So you give them money if you want, let them come and buy from the market, but you should not be providing anything else. So in the first few years, the project survived on speaking about the poor and those who are connected with their systems. And I'm using the poor very generically. All those connected to the system as being people who needed to be tracked, and you needed to make sure that nobody else was coming in. So to catch the bad guy, all the good guys and all the guys who needed all the support that the state would offer would have to subject themselves to a system that may not work for them. But it was experimentation on a nationwide basis. The whole population was the experimental, we were the lab, the whole population. And that's kind of extraordinary. But they did it anyway because, you had a tech person coming in and saying, I'll show you how it can be done. And that's how, so the tech person then gets inducted into the government with the rank of a cabinet minister, but without being a cabinet minister, which means that he didn't really have to enter parliament and he didn't have to face public questioning, but he would have all the privileges of a cabinet minister of that rank. And that's how they went ahead with the project. But we've seen that since 2014, which is when the present government came into power, and especially from 2017, where suddenly they just opened this up and said that nobody is entitled to anything unless you go to every system and embed your number in. We want to see you there. It's also important that although the earlier dispensation was a much more liberalization, capitalist kind of dispensation, they still started alongside the UID project, another project called NatGrid, which is the National Intelligence Grid, where they were saying that they would be able to link up from multiple databases to be feeding it into multiple security and intelligence agencies. So it became an intelligence operation with this. And when we asked for the National Intelligence Grid to just give us the, through the right to information process, asked them that you've made a presentation of what the National Intelligence Grid is to the cabinet. Just share with us what the project is, not what you're finding in the project. They waited for a little till they could notify themselves out of the Right to Information Act, saying, till then they were saying we are just a pipeline. So there's nothing, no security, no intelligence. We're just a pipeline. The moment the question was asked, they said they hid themselves behind being a security establishment and therefore not being amenable to the RTI. These projects don't stand alone. They come along with a whole host of other things. So for the state, knowing where everyone is, what everyone is doing, and converting, this is a real, I think, conceptually, it's been very important with this government that they really believe, it's like the opposite of Snowden. When Snowden happened in America, we all watched, and I must say, I don't know what the American public thinks of Snowden, but he's a great hero for all of us here. Because we do need to hold the state in check. And the state hides behind secrecy much too much and much too often. But when Snowden spoke, the American establishment said something that was very interesting for us. They said that we don't do it to Americans. It's a foreign intelligence thing. We only do it. Here, it's the opposite. They said, we are not, it's our people. We can do what we want with it.
Right.
That's how we are losing rights.
Cost of doing business, right?
Tell you how much.
Yeah.
That's such a good point. It's such an important point.
Yeah. I want to bring in Marta, and Marta, really on this topic of state actors, privacy, surveillance. I know you've done a lot of work with, EFF and others and kind of thought a lot about these topics. And so maybe the question I'll pose to you is, how do, if at all, decentralized systems play in this place? Like, how do they limit the abilities of state actors to obtain access to this kind of information? And what are alternatives that decentralized systems can pose for us?
Yeah. So, I think for me, getting into cryptocurrency and being interested in it from a civil liberties angle, the most important thing about cryptocurrency and other decentralized technologies is that it gives you the ability to make financial transactions, to engage in transactions online in a way that is fully anonymous. And I think for me, just hearing about this is sort of making my skin crawl, thinking about the ways that this amount of data can be used, and the amount of mass surveillance that can be enabled by this type of database. And so, from a decentralized technology perspective, I think having the ability to actually transact anonymously for me is so important I'm so sorry. That was very bad, loud.
This is what happens in the evening. No worries.
Right, exactly. Thank God we're not live. Oops. So I think for me, I think it's, having the ability to transact anonymously is so important. And, not having to identify yourself in order to make transactions online, just as one example, I think is so important.
So, one of the areas that a bunch of folks work on in the blockchain and crypto world, Marta, is the establishment of digital self-sovereign identity solutions, right? And it comes from this perspective that we need identity. And, you know, I suppose I sometimes sit on the fence in this, because I've always found in some respects the Bitcoin and sort of crypto ideal very romantic, that no, let's just find a way to transact, as you put it, completely anonymously, right? But the reality is so much of the existing world depends upon this self-identification concept that we've built entire economic systems that depend upon the idea that I can trust you, Marta, to prove that you, Marta, are who you are. And so I wonder, like, is there a way? I mean, do these systems, is it possible for us to sort of jury rig a decentralized, privacy preserving model onto the concept of identifying the human being in this, you know, as a proxy for the world that we've created? Or should we abandon the whole thing altogether and just try to live anonymously? Because that seems impossible.
Well, I mean, I think that when you start thinking about how decentralized technologies might work with regards to identity, I think reasonable minds can differ as to whether that's a good idea. But I think that there's at least a really interesting line of thinking around this idea of being able to, you know, sort of use zero knowledge technologies in order to be able to, you know, query a database without decrypting it, for example, and figure out whether what someone is saying is true without actually having to, you know, have any one person have access to an entire database. And so, you know, I think reasonable minds can and do differ about whether that technology is going anywhere, whether it's a really viable technology. But I think it's really interesting. I mean, I remember in one of the earliest conversations I was having about decentralized technologies, we were talking with someone about, I think we were talking about the Enigma project in its early days, and we were talking about we were actually specifically talking about the refugee type of example. I was specifically talking with someone from the UN about it, and he was really excited about this technology because he really loved the idea of being able to potentially use the technology that Enigma was using to be able to query a database and say, you know, and without decrypting the information within it, you know, figure out information about particular individuals in order to facilitate, you know, refugee aid. So again, whether or not this is something that is technology that will move far is reasonable minds can differ. I will admit that I tend to prefer fighting for our rights to engage with the world anonymously, rather than that tends to be my preferred way to engage in the space of identity. And I really do think that we live in a world where people believe that privacy and anonymity are bad and enable bad things, right? That anonymity is something that enables crime. But you know, it's really a misconception. Privacy and anonymity are not bad. They're not illegal, and I think they're absolutely essential for civil liberties, regardless of the technology or the type of transaction you're engaging in. Yeah.
I've always liked the idea that in fact they're critical to democracy, right? I mean, that we have a secret ballot for a reason. You know, that there is this space that we need to create around the individual that protects them from you know, the prying eyes of anyone else, for the ability to actually safely, accurately, you know, exercise your free will as a human being. And so not only democracies, but markets themselves require this in some way. But it's interesting, like, you know, it's interesting you were mentioning Enigma. I mean, Guy Ziskind was developing that when I was at MIT with him. So we were fascinated by the power of zero knowledge proofs and, you know, the homomorphic encryption concepts that he and others were coming up with. And the romantic idea there, and I must say, I'm still very drawn to it, I think finds this balance. I think it can find a balance where as long as we get away from the language that we're using here about identifying the human being and the need to sort of define who you are as a person, and instead think about, okay, but how do we prove the veracity of the various claims that are being made in exercise of the attempt to make a transaction? And you start to sort of like depersonalize the concept. And it's simply the idea that as a society or as an economy, really, we can't transact unless we can prove the veracity of that information, and then understand things on those levels. Then these other models, whether you want to call it self-sovereign identity or it's rather just zero knowledge proofs, become really powerful. And I suppose my question to you, Marta, is because since you've been so active in the advocacy space, and you've just, as Sheila noted, you've gotten, you were on Capitol Hill just a couple of weeks ago. It sounds to me as if the key problem is the conversation and the actual language that we use to define these problems. How closer are we? Because you just said, we think anonymity is a bad thing, and privacy is obviously something that people are using to try to get her and skirt around. There's only bad people who do that. Is there any movement the other way? I mean, surely Snowden, as Usha pointed out, has opened people's eyes to some of this. Do you feel as if there is anything of a change in the way people perceive these things, or are we still stuck in this expectation that we have to identify people all the time?
I mean, I think if anything, the movement of the direction is unfortunately the wrong way. I mean, I think what we've been seeing, particularly in the context of financial transactions, is the US government and governments all around the world taking the ideas behind the mass surveillance of the traditional financial system and applying it to cryptocurrency and other decentralized technologies in order to make it as hard as possible to transact anonymously. There are many examples of that just in recent months, including FinCEN's proposed regulations, FATF's proposals, and most recently the infrastructure bill, which of course there's much to be said about that. Yeah, is still fun. And the fundamental idea behind that is, that anyone who is transacting with someone else needs to be recording those transactions and figuring out the identity of doing KYC on the people who are doing those transactions and reporting it to the government, right? And it doesn't matter whether you're, in the government's eyes, it doesn't matter whether you're a decentralized exchange and you're really just, and it's really just code that's sitting between me and you. The idea is that any of these technologies are going to be sort of categorized as a broker, and we'll have to report who these people are and what these transactions are to the government. And I think in the financial system, we've just sort of accepted for many years the idea that we need to have these transactions turned over to the government because terrorism, right? Because, right. And we just sort of accept that is normal. And I actually think that it's unconstitutional, and that we shouldn't accept as normal that all of our transactions are automatically turned over to the government. And so I think we're unfortunately living in a time when it's very much pushing the opposite direction. It's very much the United States government and governments around the world pushing for every transaction to be associated with a particular individual, and for that information to be reported to the government in this sort of system of mass surveillance that we just happen to accept because it's financial transactions.
I think it's such a great point, Marta, that you're raising. And Michael, I want to kind of call back something that you were talking about. We can't consider anonymity in a vacuum, right? It is anonymous to whom? And every time you drill down in that kind of turtles all the way down context, it winds up being the state. Ultimately, the state is the main actor who does not want anonymity to be the watchword, right? To be like kind of the norm. Because generally speaking, two individuals in a transaction on the other side of a transaction care a lot more about the finality of the transaction than about who the transaction was with. Not always the case. I may want to only, transfer my grandmother's photos to my aunt, right? And nobody else, right? It's very important in certain contexts who is the recipient of something. But in generally, when you're talking about money or finances, the amount that you care about the anonymity is much less than the amount you care about the finality and the ability to know that you have received whatever amount you're supposed to get, you have transferred whatever amount you're supposed to get, and you can just kind of walk away. And there is some system of trust in whatever that might be in place that enables that finality, right? The anonymity really comes down every time when you just drill and you go scrape the layers back. It's down to the power of the state, the desire of the state, and I use that term in its most generic sense, to have visibility into the actions of residents, citizens, foreign actors, whatever it might be. And the reasons for that, I think, do vary. They're not always malevolent, but they're not always benevolent either. So Chithi, really want to get your thoughts on this part of the conversation we've been having. I've seen you nodding and leaning in, so I really want to bring you into this too.
It's India's survived all these years without having everyone have an ID. Yeah, so we've not lived by the ID. In fact, one of the strangest conversations I had was in Germany in Weimar. There was a conference, and then after I spoke, one of the women came up and said, she was German. She said, but how do you get anything if you don't have an ID? And I said, what do I want that will need an ID? I mean, why an ID is another thing I want then. If I just want my food, why do I need an ID to have my food? If I need health services, why do I need, if I'm ill, the doctor sees that I'm ill and takes care of that. Why does the doctor need to, figure out how I am on a database before they give me treatment? That's how we've lived all these years. I think there is something about countries and systems that have lived with IDs for so long that you're thinking that, well, since you need an ID anyway, maybe you should do a digital ID. I actually think this is catching the wrong end of the stick. And the one definite thing about any kind of ID system is that it produces centralization. Whether it is centralization with companies, whether it's centralization with the state, it produces centralization. And centralization is a very bad thing for democracy. We need decentralization. We need people in control of their own lives. We need people to be able to speak truth to power. We need people to be able to speak and to be heard. If everything is going to be determined about a person by just looking at how the system identifies them as being who they think they say they are, then we are missing the point about democracy altogether. Actually, I find that in places where these systems exist, the first norm is obedience. And in the Indian context, we've learned through history that when something is not all right and we need to say it, we say it through civil disobedience. And that's the kind of thing that gets taken away when you have these centralized systems. So I just think that our imagination is getting boxed into this idea of whether it's this kind of identity or this kind of ID or that kind of ID. I also find it deeply disturbing that the UN, which for the longest time in the civil liberties manifesto that they have, the ideas of identity, which means that you have a way in which we have multiple identities. Sheila, you know that. You certainly don't have one identity, you have multiple, and we claim you as much as America claims you. So, this idea that an ID determines identity is so false. All it does is to help states and systems that want to track you. It doesn't provide people with freedom. It doesn't provide people with control over their own lives. It doesn't help. In fact, what it does is also the kind of systems where we used to have collectives working together to set systems right have got replaced by this kind of top-down. ID systems are always top-down. It's not about my using it. It's about it being used on me. So why can't we get out of this imagination of the of the ID and think of other ways in which we identify ourselves?
So maybe because the nation state is there. So I don't want to. I think Sheila set it up well. The state is. I think that's a great way to frame it. The state is the one that ultimately is the one with the interest in that anonymity. And to your point, Usha, it is. We can survive without it, but at the same time, that is the structure of the world. And I'm thinking as you say this about refugees who are going to be leaving Afghanistan right now and trying to get out and getting across the border and being demanded by an immigration official to prove who they are. What do you say to them? I mean, how do you surely they need an ID, and they don't want an ID that's issued by the Taliban, right? They want some form of proof, because whether we like it or not, that immigration official on the Pakistan border or on the Turkish border, wherever you're going to come across, is going to demand that you somehow prove, because that's the system, whether we like it or not. How do we deal with that? How do we deal with the reality of the system?
You know what? Yeah, Michael, you said it many times in the way you said it now. Whether you like it or not. If we do not like it, there's no reason why we don't work to change it. It is not all right that people are having to run away from a regime that they fear, that they are terrorized by, and they will be stopped and told, prove to me who you are. It is not all right.
Okay, so the problem is
refugees are not about identity. Refugees are about refuge.
Okay.
That's what's distorting this whole thing. If I'm hungry, I need food. If I'm hungry, you tell me, come and prove to me that this is who you are before I give you food. There's a problem. The problem is not that they are not able to identify themselves. The problem is that the system is being put in a place where they can't reach their food. I really think we need a completely different imagination on this. We've allowed the state and companies to shape our imagination. We are not able to think outside. We really need to get out of this.
That's a really good answer. I mean, that's...
I'll also say this. See, now they're creating an ID system here, and we are finding so many people are dropping out of it because they just can't measure up to the system. If I were to try, I mean, I don't have a UID, I'm not enrolled on the system, and I've written, the only place where I'm asked to embed this is with the income tax department. I have sent they only have, it's all digital now. So I've sent hard copies of my returns to the department. And I've written long letters to them saying, listen, these are all my concerns about the ID. It's a simple thing. If I'm enrolled onto the system and I'm asked to identify myself through my biometric, and my biometric has changed, the only way I can update that is if I have a registered mobile number on the UID database, to which I will make a request saying, listen, my fingerprint is not working. They will send me an OTP on that registered mobile system. Then using the OTP, I'll go and update. Now, the problem is I don't have a mobile. I don't want a mobile. Why to have an ID do I need to have a mobile? I feel mobile is it's a socially destructive artifact. I remember Giorgio Agamben coming and speaking in one of our universities here and saying that the one thing that he would love to do is to have everyone throw their mobile phones into the nearest lake. And then he stopped and said, but then it'll pollute the lake. So we have to find some other means. So, our IDs are no longer just IDs, they are trackers. And they are not, although they start off with saying, this is so that you can have an ID to prove yourself. You're being asked to prove yourself in places where you shouldn't be asked for this. And that's where you're most under threat.
So you said something back into my answer. I thought it was I just want to make a comment because I think it's extremely powerful. This idea that the problem is not that the lack of ID for the refugees, but that they are refugees and that we are denying them food. And what struck me as you said that I just want to remark on is that the acceptance of these systems, the real price we pay is in our own imagination, because we are now compelled to think that that's what has to happen, that we need to resolve this problem of identification, and not the real problem is that why do we go to war? Why do we force these people from their homes? And why don't we give them food and shelter when they demand it? That's a really, it's the trap of the logic that is the problem. And I think that's just a very powerful point. So thank you for finding that hole in my argument. I really appreciate it.
I didn't mean to do that. It was just a conversation.
No, it was very powerful. It really struck me very strongly. Thank you for doing so.
But it really is, I think, a call for all of us, especially those working in the crypto ecosystem who are claiming to try and be building a better system, which is, are we pursuing incremental change within parameters that are being thrust upon us by other actors that we're accepting? Or are we really pushing for systemic change? And I think, we've had this I actually had a discussion with each of the three of you independently, but I personally think that we ought to be pushing for systems change, like to really think as big as we can, to question the fundamentals of how we orient to each other in what constitutes an equitable, a just society. And I think you have to go all the way. You have to have a personal philosophy behind all of this, or you can't, I don't think you can really do the work. The other thing I just want to note is that I can 100% confirm that Chithi does not have a mobile, because on the family WhatsApp chat that she's not on, it comes up on occasion. If only she were here, she would know about what we're saying about whatever her latest speech she gave or whatever. So, but it is such a, I've always admired that about you, Chithi. It's such a testament to, living by your convictions, because you're not wrong. I mean, I know full well that I have 2 mobile devices, and there's no question in my mind that, there's all kinds of stuff happening with that information that's going through that and where it's pinging and whatnot. And I know that because I am a former privacy attorney. So I'm well aware of the consequences of that behavior. And yet, here I am, right? So, but Marta,
I'm privileged to have weekend Sheila and a week Sheila in my contact list, but no one else, not many people do.
Very rare. Most people don't know. They don't know there's another one. Actually, I'm now owning it. There are 2 phones, one or the other. Some are on both. But I'm noting again, Michael, that you've got 3 lawyers here again. So yet again, I lawyered you. This is another one of the episodes where without even realizing it, 3 with a bunch of lawyers. So Marta, I want to bring you back in here to just kind of, again, comment on what we've been talking about here and your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I mean, I was really struck by that point as well. And, it's really interesting. Like we also see sort of during the pandemic, like even just in the United States, we've seen that like it's become somewhat impossible to pay cash anywhere anymore, right? Like speaking of like, if you want to sort of get through the world without surveillance, like, and I think a lot about financial surveillance. It's really become very hard to get by with cash. And, for me, I think that the thing, as I've said, that I love so much about cryptocurrency is it takes the anonymity of cash and imports it into the online world. But just like to further underscore the point about the importance of anonymous transactions, I always think about these pictures. And what you were saying was making me think about these pictures from the Hong Kong protests. And they were showing these really long lines at the subway stations where there were pro-democracy protesters who were waiting to purchase their tickets with cash because they didn't want their electronic purchases to place them at the scene of the protest, right? And I think for me, that really underscores the point that a cashless society is a surveillance society. And I think it really shows the importance of having the ability to move through the world and to make transactions and to buy food or to receive aid without being tied to your identity.
Chithi, did you want to say something? I felt like you were.
Yeah, no, I was just thinking while you were talking, Marta, that with EFF being where you are, it's really time to do a civil liberties audit of all these technologies and of these IT systems, a civil liberties audit. And I was also thinking that, the way we've been pushed to this is through fear and uncertainty. And I don't think any democracy can function if our fundamental, thought is going to be colored by fear and uncertainty. And if we look even about, even refugees moving across, I hear the kind of conversation that the kind of thing that the state says, where they'll say terrorists could come through. So it's like people in distress become dangerous people. And we need to find a way by which we, find the language to change this discourse. Also that increasingly we are seeing, right now we are caught up in this thing of the NSO company in Israel surveilling our activists and journalists and various kinds of people who really matter and to keep democracy functioning, because they are active people in this. And we're finding that these technologies, so it's almost like there is a technology and then it gets used. So I'm thinking that, one of the basic ways in which it's been presented to us, technology, is that innovation in technology cannot be confined by rules. So innovation should happen without rules, and then the rules will have to be made to accommodate the innovation. I think there's something really fundamentally wrong with that. So if they do want to continue innovating, I think every technology that comes in, especially those which have any context of its relationship with the people, has to have a period when it is in moratorium, has to be tested, and if it's not okay, we don't take it in. If you remember what happened when CRISPR was first found, there was this thing that no, you can't use it for this and this, that, and the other, so nobody will use it, and then it becomes a technology that starts getting used in some places, and then therefore it becomes all right to use it everywhere because everyone's competing to be ahead of the other. I think this kind of unhealthy competition can only be stopped if there is a much wider engagement in deciding whether technologies that have been found can or cannot be deployed among the people. That moratorium is becoming increasingly important. We need to think about it. I'm not quite sure how we'll do it, but it's something that I think we should work towards, and very quickly. Like this facial recognition technology, I think in the US you have a number of places where they've said no. So that's a blanket no. And that acts like a moratorium because you never know when it can change, but at least you have that time when you're figuring out what it means, who it means, what does it mean to whom. That's an important spell which we shouldn't lose.
So, Marta, I fear with the question that I wanted to throw here, we really need to wrap this pretty soon, but I'm at risk of opening another Pandora's box here. But Usha was talking about facial recognition technology, and this conversation has been about the state and the power of the state. But I mean, as you know well, and you've done a lot of work in this space, there is the fear of the centralized corporation being all powerful as well. And I'm immediately thinking of the move that Apple made in this past month to, in the name of some good cause, I suppose, introducing, yes, facial recognition technology of a kind to monitor people's photos on their phones to prevent the trafficking of child porn. And of course, a backlash because of all of the nefarious ways in which this perhaps well-intended concept could go awry. What's your message on all of that? And how do we tie what we've been talking about with regard to state surveillance to this other idea, this, something we've talked a lot about the show of corporate surveillance, of surveillance capitalism, as it's being called. What's the lessons here, and how do we apply the same to both realms?
Yeah. Well, I think the thing that we learned from the Snowden disclosures, one of the many things we learned from the Snowden disclosures, is that corporate surveillance is government surveillance. I'm thinking of specifically the PRISM slide. That was, the slide that shows all of the corporations that
Google, Apple, the full panoply of all of them. Yep. That
were working with the government on the PRISM program, in order to illegally spy on in order to illegally spy on Americans. And so I think that's what we learned from the Snowden disclosures, is that corporate surveillance is government surveillance. We also, EFF, where I'm special counsel, has been working, even before the Snowden disclosures, was suing the NSA for its mass surveillance program, where it partnered with AT&T and had a literal back room, and where all of the traffic going through was being captured and scanned. And I think when you get to fast forward to the Apple encryption backdoor, I think no matter how well-intentioned the reason, mass surveillance is mass surveillance, and this is mass surveillance. And I'm horrified. And I understand that it's, for a good reason, but I mean, that's always the reason, it's always in the name of counterterrorism or in the name of protecting children, right? It's always protect the children. And let's just put this one small, tiny backdoor in our encryption, right? And the problem is, it's trivially, once you've added a backdoor, it's trivially easy, just trivial, small changes turn it into much bigger programs. And we know that the government partners with private corporations on these mass surveillance programs. And that's just the United States government, right? And Apple can talk all it wants about how it's going to, how it's going to be implementing these, narrowing it, whatever. But at the end of the day, you've added a backdoor, and you're enabling a mass surveillance system. So, I mean, I'm pretty horrified by it.
A door is a door, whether it's in the back or the front of the house, right?
Or how small it is.
Or
smell. You can get in it. It serves the same purpose,
Well, it's also, to the point about moratoriums that you were raising, it's like, you can't put the toothpaste back in the tube. And once you've started squeezing it, it's very easy. It's much more easy to get momentum and just keep going, Marta, to your point, right? Like once there's a back door, that's a door and, you're there. And so, and then you get that scope creep, right? We're all familiar with scope creep in a million different contexts. Well, it happens in this case as well. And so I love the idea. San Francisco put this ban on facial recognition and surveillance in the city, in part because they wanted to do studies and examination about what are the pros and cons. They're looking at cities like London that are extremely highly surveyed to kind of see like, what are the benefits? Have you actually realized, these benefits, and what are these benefits? Are they spurious? Are they real? Are they tangible? Has crime reduced? Have the things that you claim are going to be happening? You can now experiment because there are many cities in the world that do have extensive surveillance. So SF, where I live, has chosen to wait, at least at a minimum, and kind of see and then make decisions about where that might be actually helpful. Again, all within the context of the city's goals, which may or may not reflect the goals of communities within the city or without the city, right? That around the city that may or may not share those same goals. It's important to understand who the actor is that's making that decision. Anyhow, we could go on for another hour. I have no doubt. This was such, like I said, a very special episode, for me. Thank you so much to Marta Belcher, to my aunt, Usha Ramanathan. As always, Michael Casey, thanks so much for joining me on this journey. Stay tuned for next week's episode of Money Reimagined. Thanks so much for joining us.